Servants Association has threatened a massive strike amid a deadlock during government wage talks. Eskom is also facing a possible strike over salary hikes. To help us understand how wage disputes can be resolved during the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm joined by Andrew Levy, a labour specialist at Andrew Levy Employment. Good to have you with us this afternoon, Mr. Levy. So talk to us about this strike season. It looks like whenever it's time for wage negotiations, true as Bob, there will be some sort of strike action taking place in the country. Talk to us about this phenomenon that seems to repeat itself year after year.
Yeah, indeed it does, Tommy, and it's not really technically called strike season. It's called the wage round, and that explains it perfectly. In other words, it's the time of the year when the most important negotiations take place, and once they've settled, that sets the pattern for all of the other negotiations as they fall into line. And obviously they are the trend setters, so they tend to indicate very, very strongly where settlements are going to be. Now, if you look in South Africa, the key settlements are clearly the government, the public servants, because they're the biggest single group of employees, the metal industry, the motor industry, and the mining industry. Those are the key ones, and it just so happens that at this time of the year, this is when they negotiate. And of course, if they're negotiating, there is always a risk of strike action. But it is far more the case that strikes are threatened than they normally happen. So given the style that the unions negotiate in, particularly, which is really very much an aggressive style, it is quite probable that there will be some form of threat, strike, dispute, whatever the case may be. And that's why we see it now. When it comes to the probability of strike action this year, the first thing we can note is that last year, strike action came right down, a fraction of what it was before. And that's obvious because firstly, for 3 months, no one was working. And secondly, everyone is battling financially. There's no question about that. Now, equally, given the style of negotiation, the unions tend to be a little bit extravagant, shall we say, in their threats. So it's always going to be the mother of all strikes. It'll bring the country to its knees, and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is it's highly unlikely. I don't think that there is going to be a completely solid and supported public sector strike. And I don't think that if there is, it'll last for any length of time.
And give us the reasons why, Andrew, you believe that there will not be widespread striking.
Yeah, for the simple reason that the public sector particularly are very highly paid and have a lot of financial obligations, and it's very difficult to support a strike on that basis. Now, if you look at the
I guess it also depends, Andrew, who you're talking about with the public sector, because the unions are not happy with the public sector wage freeze that the government has implemented for the next 3 years. And you will remember as well that even though the unions lost the appeal at the Labour Court, they are taking this to the Constitutional Court. So certainly not taking this entire wage situation sitting down.
No, and I mean, one wouldn't expect them to, but neither would I expect them to win in the Constitutional Court. I don't actually want to go into a long legal explanation right now.
But perhaps you could give us a summary, though, as to why you believe that they don't stand a chance at the Constitutional Court.
Well, I think that the Constitutional Court will jib at the notion that the government has to borrow money that it doesn't have in order to pay salaries. And I think that's going to be the sticking point. We largely are bankrupt in the public sector. If we look at Eskom, we are virtually bankrupt. We've got huge billions and billions of rands of debt. If you look at SAA, it was the same story, and the strike in SAA was a damp squib. The unions lost it hands down. And that's another point, that unions are losing strikes at the moment. And remember, you've got to distinguish between the noises the union makes and the appetite that the workers themselves, the employees themselves, have towards striking. Now, in the public sector, certain unions are more militant than others. So, for example, the pockets of militancy, I believe, include the nurses, who arguably should not strike at all, the teachers, who equally one can question, and transport. Now, they may strike, but for how long the strike will go on remains to be seen. There are many unions that will choose not to or will go for a token strike.
And what are the impacts of strikes on companies? Let's take a look at Eskom, for example, the impact of the Eskom strike, what that would do to not only the company but also the country.
Yes, well, it would be a disaster for the company, obviously. It would impact, depending on who goes on strike, it would impact on the business and potentially the economy. So, for example, if the workers whose job it is to feed coal to the power stations stop working, then we don't have power. And that, of course, will pose a huge, huge challenge to the government, because what do they do at that stage? And as far as I recall, Eskom is still subject to what is known as an essential industry order, which means they cannot go on strike. And what the LRA provides is that they must go to arbitration. And whether or not an arbitrator would award or not, well, remains to be seen.
Let's talk to us about the intricacies of negotiating during COVID-19. We understand that there's been a lot of financial pressure on companies as well as the economy. So perhaps not as much liquid cash making the rounds. But are there ways that these negotiations can unfold where the unions and the workers also get some relief? The food basket is more expensive. It's more expensive to live as it, than it was before. Could we perhaps look at things like housing allowances, perhaps, and health deductions that can be included in the process that would feel like a win for the pockets of the workers?
Look, there's no question that workers are feeling the pinch. And the ones who are feeling the pinch most are the ones at the bottom of the pay distribution, because they have the least disposable income. And what I would like to see is far more of a sacrifice amongst the higher paid and a favouring of the lower paid. So I think that would be a step in the right direction. Equally, the issue of a wage freeze, if it's required to save the company, is something that really makes more sense than not. But I think that if we are going to pay anything, firstly, it's going to be much less. And secondly, hopefully, it will bring some relief to the lowest paid.
You mentioned sacrifice from those who are earning more. We're talking management. But that is hardly a conversation that is ever had, or at least put on the table for possible discussion. Why not?
No, we're not talking management here. We're talking about those who you may conveniently call workers in the public sector in this conversation, who are amongst the best paid in the country for people in that condition. I mean, whilst public sector workers want you to believe that they are badly off, they are infinitely better off than their brethren in the private sector. To come back to your question, well, if you're talking about management, why don't we do that? Well, the answer is that we don't negotiate management salaries. Management salaries are something which is at the company's discretion. And of course, there have been very few increases in managerial salaries. And certainly, if you look right at the top end of the management spectrum, there have been a number of chief executives who said, I am not going to take any money by way of any increase or any bonus this year because of the circumstances. But I think the idea that the union could perhaps enter into a dialogue whereby management would agree to cut their salaries and give it to the unions is highly unlikely. People tend to look after their own interests.
Is there then a fundamental flaw in the structure, and is this a flaw that can even begin to be addressed?
Mm-hmm. There are numerous fundamental flaws in the system. We're never going to do away with strikes because if there were no strikes, the threat to strike would have no currency. But our strikes have been particularly damaging and very negative on the economy, on growth, etc. Now, government did implement at the start of last year an outstanding document called the Code of Good Practice, Collective Bargaining, Strikes, Picketing. And that contains 50, 60 pages of really good practical advice as to how people can bring negotiations into the realm of reality. Unfortunately, it appears to have made little impact at all upon the union movement. So their pattern of negotiation has remained very much the same. And government, because it's a code, lacks the teeth to enforce it, and I'm not sure that they would want to. There are constitutional issues here as well. So we really are in a very difficult position at this moment. And I would like to suggest that in reality, wage increases right now are not the priority. The priority must be for job security. We lost nearly 2 million jobs because of the shutdown and COVID, and very few of those jobs are going to be replaced in the near future. And I think it's infinitely better, may not be attractive, to have no wage increase and have a secure job and to try and maintain an income in the future than it is to have a short-term increase, which will result in retrenchments.
You made mention, Mr. Levy, of a strategy document that speaks to how negotiations can happen and how to prevent strikes. But you also, in the same breath, mentioned that perhaps government would not really have a desire or political will to implement some of those suggestions because of constitutional issues. Highlight some of those for us and perhaps a summary of the recommendations therein.
Well, I can't summarize the recommendations because there are 60 pages of them. The issue at its heart is that collective bargaining in South Africa is a voluntary undertaking between unions and management. There is no legal duty to bargain. And the state itself sees its role, as indeed it should be in a rights-based democracy, to provide a vehicle, a methodology for parties to engage, parties being management and unions, and to, drive their own ship, as it were. We're not a Stalinist economy where everything is pre-planned and controlled. And given that Section 23 of the Constitution contains the labor rights, which include the right to strike, the right to fair labor practice, government would not intervene because to do so could well be unconstitutional. And I think that's as it should be.
Thank you very much for your perspective there as we look at the lay of the land as far as strikes in the country are concerned, as well as the role of government or lack thereof because of certain intricacies that Mr. Levy has just pointed out for us. Thank you very much for your time. That's the labour specialist, Mr. Andrew Levy.